When you look at attention as an asset, just like real estate or money, how do you harness and protect it? So there are five things that really impact our ability to harness and protect attention. And these five things can be designed in work and in life in order to improve that whole situation and make our tech tools be like hammers again. A hammer is a tool that is sitting there patiently, waiting to be picked up and used when we need it. Our phones are not hammers. They scream at us all the time. The
Yes.
tabs, right, in our laptops scream at us, and we have it in multiple devices and all day long.
Welcome to Manager, a podcast about the experiences of people leaders and how we can enable them to lead engaged, healthy, and high-performing teams. I'm Kamaria Scott, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us as we learn, lead, and succeed together. Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Manager. Sometimes when I think about topics that I want to bring to you, it's not some of the things that you might commonly hear about, like how do you give feedback or how do you delegate? Sometimes the topic is really relevant to how do you take care of yourself as a people leader? And then once you take care of yourself, how do you then pass that on to the people you might lead? So I'm super excited to introduce today's guest to you because she and I had a conversation that made me really reflect on how I was managing myself and my own capacity. And I thought you all would find it to be extremely beneficial as well. So I would love to introduce my new friend, Michelle Moore, to the podcast. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad you decided to join us. So, if you would you just tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your experience leading teams, and what interesting thing you're doing now?
Sure. So my background is management consulting. I grew up after getting my MBA in Houston in the big four corporate world, but not in the United States. I shipped off to Moscow after graduation and started in the first professional services IT consulting firm that was being created at that time in Eastern Europe. I became a manager and then made partner in like 8 years.
Mm.
So that was also without any training. Back then, you just got promoted based on your ability to kind of speak well and do a good job with your clients and sell stuff, right? And so I was thrown into this practice management role as a partner where I was managing brand new teams. And I remember just thinking, this is easy. Leading people is easy. But later you find out it's not when the problems start, when people start quitting. But yeah, so I was just thrown into a pool without knowing how to swim on many fronts, right? In a new country and in a new, really in a new business, right? Leading people was something that I think came naturally to me, but I don't think I understood how to really do it professionally until years later.
You've come a long way since then. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing today.
So, you know how really smart people who think for a living, sometimes these days, with this age of tech overwhelm and busyness and relentless task switching, they feel their brain power slowly ebbing away. Maybe even their creativity is ebbing away. I help smart experts like that get their intellectual, creative capacity back by harnessing attention, by creating an intentional relationship with their tech.
I
And a
love
lot
it.
of details on work design sort of around that. Right. So that's the short version. But yeah,
That's
there's
the
more to it
short
than that. But
version.
yeah.
So when we first had our conversation, what stood out to me when you said that the words that jumped out at me were mental capacity. And I thought about, my gosh, as a manager, one of the things that I found was that my mental capacity was so important to how well I could lead my team and how well I could manage the responsibilities that I had been given. I'm curious because I've not heard anybody really talk about that before, if in a management capacity or just in general. What led you to want to focus and think about mental capacity?
So I think I didn't start realizing mental capacity was a thing until I had finished my 15 years in Russia. I moved to Canada. Then I took a job leading a tech philanthropy startup full of people, only 12 people, small team,
Okay.
way younger than me. So I'm getting into this team And the first thing I have to do is learn what Slack is. I have to learn what Google Drive is, right? This is 2015, 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm thrust into this very small startup environment with very brilliant young people who do things 10 times faster than me.
Mm.
And that is when I started noticing my own panic in terms of, oh, can I learn this stuff fast enough? And how am I going to handle being in 95 Slack channels? Do I have to look at all of them because I lead this team? That began at that time in 2016. And that was also for me the time when I switched from BlackBerry to iPhone. And I really started to have apps on my phone. So maybe I'm a little late
Oh,
to the game, but
yeah.
I'm much older than you, right? And so I learned I learned all of this from this team, right? But then once I got a handle on my new learning and onboarding, leading this team in this tech atmosphere, I had then space to observe my team and help them better when they were overloaded. And so what I noticed was the constant task switching. I
Mm-hmm.
noticed, because this is a social purpose enterprise, that the team, the employees, all super motivated to go above and beyond for the philanthropic foundations that they served with grant making,
Mm-hmm.
software sales, and implementation. So this is a team of not only high achievers, but high achievers who believe in the deep, deep purpose of their work, that they're doing impact philanthropy, that they're helping solve social problems for good. And so getting people to slow down and prioritize, this was the hardest thing. So we really had to sit down and say, well, you can't do everything. Let's recognize that everybody has too much on their plate. Everybody loves what's on their plate, but you had to sit down and say, what is going to add the most value to your client and to yourself today?
Mm.
So this putting together a simple pie chart and saying, what are the top 3 things I need to get done this day or this week? That was the hardest thing to manage continuously.
Yeah.
This phrase was coined at that time in my team, I'm sure in multiple teams as well. We have Slack on crack, right? We feel like we're
Yes.
Slack on crack, but we want to be engaged. We want to respond to our colleagues in all these channels. And so
Mm-hmm.
we started to have conversations around, does this make sense? Aren't you getting tired? And of course, these are people, very young people in their mid and late 20s who don't get tired that quickly. But as the years go on, that's when it gets to be a problem. So
Yeah.
that is when the discussion started. And that is when I became interested in what is the relationship we have at work with tech? And then noticing also what's the relationship we have in our personal lives with tech. So
Mm-hmm.
I think the slow exploration began there.
That's so fascinating to me because there are some of us who are of a certain age who are not digital natives, right? So we existed in a world when the most technologically advanced thing we had was email. And I even remember when that came out. And then to your point, we got cell phones, we got Slack channels. If you're not on Slack, you're in Teams. You have instant messaging on your phone, like something is pinging at you all the time. And I'm wondering if that reduction in our mental capacity, is it also affecting our attention, our ability to focus?
Well, absolutely. We know now from the research of Gloria Mark, who came out with a book called Attention Span, all her great work at Stanford and with Microsoft, when she observed teams for a long period of time on how often they were interrupted in a normal workday. And this research is out that we lose minutes every time we're interrupted. It takes us 23 minutes to get back to a task, which I don't even know how that works in a span of an hour. If you're interrupted 5 times, that's 5 times 23 minutes. That doesn't even compute. The math
Right.
doesn't compute, right? And that's the erosion of this capacity to focus, the capacity to harness attention. And what I found so interesting, because also I'm a yoga practitioner and an embodiment facilitator, I learned that attention is also a function of the body.
Interesting.
So it's the way the brain harnesses resources or
Mm-hmm.
allocates resources to perform a cognitive task. And that is happening inside the body. Whereas focus is different from attention because focus is actually a skill that can be trained. So these 2 things are being disturbed in our current world of digital overwhelm at the same time, and they're certainly linked to each other, but they are different.
I can see that. I'm neurodiverse. I have ADD. And I've learned that I've had to get to the place of turning off my notifications, just anything that's going to disrupt me so that I can focus, I can harness my attention, and I can get myself settled into whatever work I need to do. And I think that is kind of the core of what you are teaching people is how to have a good, healthy relationship with their tech where they're controlling it and it's not controlling them. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the surface kind of simple element that we can all recognize. But I think it's more complex than that
Okay.
because when you look at attention as an asset, just like real estate or money, how do you harness and protect it? So there are 5 things that really impact our ability to harness and protect attention. And these 5 things can be designed in work and in life in order to improve that whole situation and make our tech tools be like hammers again. A hammer is a tool that is sitting there patiently, waiting to be picked up and used when we need it. Our phones are not hammers. They scream at us all the time. The
Yes.
tabs, right, in our laptops scream at us, and we have it in multiple devices and all day long.
I
So
love
yeah,
that.
how do we design across these elements that impact our ability to harness attention? And yeah, that's
And so there's 5 key elements that we need to be thinking about if we really want to have this positive relationship with our technology, have us sort of like making it our hammer that we're using it to help us versus it's sort of controlling us. What are those 5 focus areas that we need to be thinking about?
so in the workplace, I think these are work design elements. And
Okay.
so the first one is the simplest one, it's focus. How much have we trained our employees and ourselves to focus? Now, that could be concentration exercises. That could be, of course, mindfulness meditation. Many corporations are giving their employees these free apps like Calm and Insight Timer and such.
Hmm.
But are they really encouraging people to train their focus not only from a well-being standpoint, because these apps have 2 benefits at the same time. They help to train focus, and it results in better well-being and better emotional state as well. So I feel like what happens in corporations is that the mindfulness apps or the focus training apps are in the HR bucket. And they're like, oh, those are just benefits. That's wellness stuff.
Right.
That's nice to have. And unfortunately, I don't think leadership is taking it as seriously as focus is a skill that needs to be trained. And
Hmm.
I also don't remember being trained in focus in college
Oh,
or in
absolutely not.
elementary school. But I think the reason why we didn't have that training is because we played outside, we built things with our hands, we weren't on screens all the time. And
Yes.
when we do tactile learning and experiential learning and embodied experiences in person, not on screens, we
Hmm.
are training our focus automatically. We are training our ability to concentrate. We are looking at another person having a dialogue, right? We don't have the
Yes.
problem of the screen and the other screen laying on the table next to us. So I think one key observation that I just continue to have is that mindfulness or concentration training is not to be left just in that HR bucket or that well-being benefits bucket. It's serious. It helps us innovate better. It helps us create. It helps us do more in less time.
Yeah. I now for myself realize how important it is to be able to focus. And so for me, that's, choosing to use real sticky notes for my brainstorming instead of digital sticky notes whenever I can. What would you say to a manager just as 1 or 2 tips that they could use for themselves or their teams to help them think more about focus that way?
So I like the idea that you gave with the real post-it notes that anything tactile, right? So putting aside concentration training or mindfulness training, of course,
Hmm.
let's do that and let's encourage that. But also anything tactile, anything when you are writing in a notebook, when you are using the post-its, when you are able to have a physical meeting with your team and have flip chart paper up on the board and
Yes.
walk around, let your feet do the voting and all of those creative practices to do value added work or important strategic work or innovation and creative work that you need to do with your team or the collaborative work. To the extent that you can do that, that's what I recommend. It's very challenging for all remote teams, though, right?
It is. Well, sort of. I think what you're saying to me is really about slowing the brain down. When I write something by hand, and I'm still an old school journaler with a piece of paper and a pen, what's really happening for me is that it forces my brain to almost go from operating at 120 to maybe like 85. And 85 is probably optimal because I'm taking the time to process versus just kind of do. And so I'm wondering if when you think about the capacity to focus and what I heard you say about harnessing our attention, it feels like I'm literally forcing my brain to slow down, to do an activity and stay with it. But it's the deliberate effort that it takes to do it tactile that means my brain has to come down a little bit. Is that close?
It's close, but I wouldn't use the word forcing because as soon as you're doing something tactile, the brain naturally slows down.
Yes.
It's not forcing. So it doesn't
Yes.
have really a forcing quality. Whereas if we have multiple monitors in front of us and we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to force ourselves to focus only on one screen, that's requiring more brain power.
Okay.
Or the phone is next to us, right? That kind of, okay, let me try to single task, even though I have all these screens in front of me and my phone is laying over there on the bed or whatever. That is a forcing quality, and the brain will get tired. Again, if we are
Mm,
trying to single task in a multi-tech
got it.
environment. But if we are in this state of anything tactile or embodied, or even a
Hmm.
walk and talk, if we're walking with a colleague and having a strategic dialogue
Okay, there we go.
without a phone, right? That is an
Yes.
example. That is not only allowing the brain to rest, but that strategic conversation is actually going to be a very high quality strategic conversation.
So, and to make this applicable, because I heard you go without the phone part, and I was like, oh, darn it. If I'm a people leader and I'm trying to help my team harness, but we are dispersed from one another, would it work if I was like, okay, put on your headphones, maybe hold your phone in your hand, don't look at it, just, put it in your pocket, and we're going to have a walking, talking team meeting?
The walk and talk without the screen, without
Yes.
looking, yeah, absolutely. That works perfectly. We had those in COVID, right? That
Yeah.
really started in COVID more than before, I think, even with friends and family, because we got so zoomed out. And then I was like, I need to do a walk and talk meeting with you because I can't do another Zoom. So I
Yes.
think it naturally happened at that time. At least in my world, I noticed that. That is okay for the brain. And that is also restful for the brain because you're just listening
Got it. Got
and
it.
you're
Okay.
still
So,
walking, so you're in your body and maybe
yep,
breathing clean air and seeing some nice nature or something, right?
I love that. Okay. So, what is the second element then? The first one was focus.
So
What's the second one?
yeah, and this is no particular order. This just happens to
Okay.
be the order that I think of it in, but it doesn't really matter what order we're in here. The second one is culture, and culture being the collection of language, values, mindsets, and behaviors of a team. So this is a giant one because when you just take the example of how are we behaving, let's say in Slack, are we even thinking about how we're behaving? Is there any structure around the communication that comes in or clarity around which channels do I have to be in on a daily basis or an hourly basis versus I just have to look at this channel once a week? So there's the culture of instant response. There's the culture of fear of missing out. There's the belief that I will be viewed as ineffective if I'm not constantly just putting an emoji onto something to show that I'm there. There's all those mind games that all of us have. And depending on our roles and how our leaders operate, they're going to be different. And that is a big conversation that's very team specific because some teams have to collaborate in an instant way if they're trying to do a product release. So in that case, okay, we're going to say instant response is great. We need to do this and let's be online and always paying attention to what's happening in this channel. But there are other cases where it's just not even necessary. And so are we thinking about things like that? So that's just
Yeah.
a loud example, I would say.
I love that. 'Cause what I'm hearing you say is that really it's the shared expectation. And I am starting to see people say things like, I'm sending you this email and I think a reasonable response time is 24 hours, or please expect a response from me in 24 hours. Because we've gotten away from what is reasonable. As we've gotten more instant, you start to feel a little insecure if you've not responded to somebody by the end of the day. When honestly, sometimes that's not realistic. I love that what you're really saying is that it's not necessarily a good or bad, it's the deliberateness of having the conversation as a team to figure out what is expected because we couldn't always be doing product releases. So maybe it's like, okay, temporarily we know right now for the next duration of time, this might be our norm. But once the product is released, then let's have another conversation about what reasonable response looks like.
And I like that you use the word reasonable. I haven't been using that word. I like the idea of having a conversation of what does reasonable mean?
Mm-hmm.
And what does reasonable mean in this project, in this team, in this company, in this period of the year or whatever it is? Because that's going to change all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. So let's move on to the third one. Okay, in no particular order, but what's third on the list or next?
So the third one is balance. And balance is probably the most nebulous. And I like to look at balance in 5 areas. In the workplace, we have balance between work and rest. We
Right.
have balance between the digital and the physical experience. We have balance between mind and body. And we have balance between tactile and embodied and digital versus physical. So, depending on which of those kind of dichotomies resonate, you can sit down and think about how am I designing my day
Mm-hmm.
such that I have, let's say, work and rest. That's kind of the easiest one, that I have enough rest in between my periods of intense work. Do I, as a human, with the body that I'm in today, let's say I have back pain like I did all last week, right? I needed to get up a lot and walk or even lie down more often because I had a back spasm. So a lot of this is individual and a lot of this can also be discussed on a team level. And it's a big, it depends. And that's why it's so nebulous.
Okay.
If we don't think about balance, we're actually going to default to not having any.
That's the key takeaway, right? If we don't think about balance, we'll have any. And I don't want to overwhelm the people leader to be like, wait, what? How do I do that? But you used work design. And it's so funny because when you said that, what struck me was quite often work design is not a conversation that we have with people leaders. I know it because I'm an IO psychologist. You know it because you're a management consultant. But typically, a people leader doesn't really encounter that word or that concept in their day to day. So I'm wondering if you can just give us a little bit more about when we talk about work design, what do we mean by that? How, if I was trying to help a manager understand it, what would you say?
A lot of people just talk about employee experience. And that's, of course, the experience that the employee has in their workday and engaging with all of the elements in that company. But work design crosses over into the employee experience because it impacts employee experience. And
Mhm.
so my definition of work design is employee experience plus those elements that impact our attention. So these 5 elements that I say are those elements that help us harness attention, I also think are the 5 elements of work design.
Okay.
And the 2 elements that we haven't talked about yet, right? We've gone through focus, culture, and balance. So the remaining 2 are the easy peasy ones because they're tangible. They're the digital toolkit, what's our tech stack, and they are the physical and the virtual environment. So I think most people, when they think of work design, think of those 2 things. What is the experience we're having in a physical workspace in the
Hmm.
office or in the cafe that we're co-working in, or in this virtual space like Zoom, right? I can see you in your background, which is not real, and you can see me and my background, which is real, right? So
Right.
that's so those are just 2 different work design, virtual design choices. And then we've made the tech choice of using Zoom to communicate with each other. So that's just very simple, right? And the design of work, though, is more complex because we need to take into account those other elements like balance,
Hmm.
focus, and culture.
When I'm chatting with managers and trying to get them to understand the concept, I try to boil it down to how. How are they going to do that? And then you have the choices that go into the how. So if they're going to brainstorm, how are they going to brainstorm? Are they going to brainstorm digitally? Are they going to brainstorm in person? I remember, like, even my team, we didn't go to the office a lot. So even though we were sort of all in the area, we didn't have to go into the office a lot. But when I wanted to do a good brainstorm, again, with my love of real sticky notes, I'd put like a little bat sign into our team's channel that meant meet me at the bat cave. I mean, we were going in the office and I was going to choose that we were going to physically brainstorm together versus do it digitally in a different way. And so there are those design choices of just how are you going to do this? and then using those elements as the guide of what you're choosing is what I think I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, and what I read a lot about or see also in the ether these days, since COVID, is meeting design, right? Frequency
Yeah.
of meeting and what's happening in the meeting, and how are we designing for psychological safety? And are we having a facilitated meeting or not? And that is also easier to wrap your head around than the whole kit and caboodle that I've mentioned.
And so the environment and digital tools, anything there that you'd want to add in terms of those two things?
So definitely, in terms of digital tools, I loved reading the book Your Happiness Was Hacked by Alex Salkover and another researcher. They challenged us that beyond email, calendar, and word processing and industry-specific tools, a team only needs 4 additional tools to do great work. I think the digital toolkit, when I was leading the philanthropy tech company in Canada, must have had 100
I was
tools
like,
in it.
4. Oh, goodness. That's
Also because people love to play in tools and have sandbox environments to try out new software and such. So it depends. So there's the extreme of what was recommended in this book of 4 tools beyond email, calendar, and word processing to what is the right tool stack that we can handle. So it's just like the cluttered closet. How many clothes do we really need? How many clothes can we wear on our body in one day? We can't wear 15 pieces of clothing, probably. Well, the same with the tech stack. We can't operate in 15 instances in a given day. So I'll refer people to Cal Newport's book called Digital Minimalism. And he's got great recommendations for implementing a minimalistic tool stack in both personal and work life.
what I find so interesting about talking to you is that we are in an increasingly digital world. So much so that it's just become the norm for us. And so when you think about 4 applications, I can hit 4 different applications before breakfast, honestly. So it's very interesting that you're almost telling people to be conscious and deliberate about their interactions. And I don't know that I've heard too many people say that if I am leading a team, trying to be deliberate and trying to be focused, how do I start to assess my relationship with tech and with apps to be like, I'm in a good place, my team is healthy, and this is good, or there might be some work to do. How do I begin to know that?
I think it comes down to the value creation exercise. So this app or this tool, how is this helping me create value? And
Mm,
which tools are an absolute must because of the company I'm working in, because of my role, for me to create value for the marketplace, for my employer, for my client? What tools are just a must have? That's a pretty short list. If I'm a coder, I need to code, right? I can't
hmm
not code. So those obvious things. And then what tools are just there because they came delivered with the whole set of everything else, or because I got them for free for buying X? It's a sit down and mapping out what is that minimum stack that is needed, especially if we're designing tech. Of course we need a tech stack. We can't go analog. That would be silly. But do we really need all of it all at one time, sitting there on our screens waiting to be clicked for whatever reason? One incentive is to really think about how the prefrontal cortex is eroding the more we task switch. This is what incentivizes me. When I think about the aging process, and as you get older, I think you start to think more about this, but what can I maintain my brain power, my brain capacity? There's so much data now showing how much task switching erodes your cognition.
mm.
The problem is we can't feel it. It's not physically hurting me. I'm not in pain. When you can't see something, it's hard to really pay attention to what it's doing. And that is the hardest part. But the pinging erodes brain capacity.
And I wonder if that's because you can't go deep in your brain. I'm a nerd. I love learning and thinking and all the things. And when I feel my brain doing its thing is when I have those opportunities to work on projects where I can really immerse myself for hours and hours and hours. And I feel like my brain's getting a workout. So what I hear you saying is that when we keep task switching, our brain can't go deep and eventually it loses the capacity to do so.
And this reminds me that I forgot one element of balance.
Mm.
How much are we tapping into our intelligence and data versus wisdom? So
Ah.
you've hit the wisdom topic, because wisdom is innate knowing, comes from the brain that's in the gut. And wisdom is the complex amalgamation of the ability to take analytic data, thinking, as well as the wider universe's data, right?
Yeah.
Or the data that comes from our gut or our intuition and from the body knowing, right? There's the embodied knowing, and then there's cognitive knowing, which is thinking. So there was a movie. It was about this issue of losing wisdom and losing wisdom practice. The former CEO of a pharmaceutical company was saying, we have all but expunged creativity from our corporations because we're so overzealous about data and analysis.
Yes, we
Data
are.
and analysis paralysis, that phrase has been around for a long time.
You mentioned that the idea here is that, yes, we are thinking about our mental capacity, but we're also thinking about how do we harness it for our well-being, productivity, and creativity. And it's that creativity part that I see suffering the most because we only want to attune to where's the data, where's the data, where's the data. And the way that we work does not even allow us to think or to give us time for creativity. How do we maybe encourage ourselves and others to lean away from the overzealousness of data and analysis back to giving ourselves space and time to tap into creativity?
So that's that balance question, right? How can we stop the over reliance on that? It's almost too simple. It's almost let us get back into a room with humans, or better yet, in nature with humans, into places with awe-inspiring views and good food and quiet, and having dialogue in person so that we can also get a sense of the collective wisdom of the team. There's that concept of big mind. There's a book called Big Mind that talks about this. And it talks about how there is collective knowing in a culture, there's collective knowing from history, and there's collective knowing in a team that knows each other. And that combined with analytic knowing is where the best solutions come from. So it's about finding those opportunities to have meetings or conferences, ideally in an analog environment, ideally tech-free, without all the presentations and the one-to-many communications. I advocate for many-to-many communications where people are in small groups having dialogue with each other, rather than the quote perceived smartest person in the room just gives a slide presentation to an audience sitting kind of bored and looking at their phones, right? So it's about that meeting design again, or about the strategy retreat design. And can you do that more in a retreat environment where you are encouraged to have dialogue without tech? And then there's creative play. Tim Herson, also a great author on creativity and play, is in Canada and holds a big conference in the woods in Northern Ontario. And it's called Mind Camp. And it's teaching all of these practices on how to harness creativity in mostly play and tactile way.
I
So
love that. How do I make this real? Increasingly, so many of us are working in distributed work environments. And there's the real push for people who do not want to go back into an office. And so some of the opportunity to balance is not always there at our fingertips, but I'm a people leader and I really do want to think about how I can lead my team differently so that I am giving them time to focus, so that I'm helping them harness their energy, that I'm not draining their ability to tap into their wisdom. What are some real practical things that I can do to manage this? And realizing obviously that I do have deliverables and all those other fun, good things. How do I find balance in that, their well-being and these results?
So, I mean, the simple answer is looking at these 5 elements that impact our ability to harness attention and that impact work design, and seeing what tweaks can be made in those areas. But specifically, if you're asking about this wisdom and intelligence thing, asking the question, is it possible to have a quarterly in-person meeting? Is it at all possible to have any in-person meetings? That's kind of the first question.
Okay.
If that's not possible, then maybe figuring out how to design that virtual meeting with a smaller number of people, with breaks where you're actually doing some of these walk and talks, even though you're virtually, like we talked about, just have the cell phone walk and talks. And having a facilitator in a quarterly virtual meeting that enables many to many dialogue instead of just the blabbing of what generally happens is
Right.
leadership blabs and everybody else is multitasking in that quarterly meeting because they just know they have to be present and they're not really listening, right? So it's about that meeting design that would enable more tapping into collective knowing. But I think it is hard to do that 100% virtually.
Well, yeah, I think you've given us some good places to start, though. It is a little bit in how you design the work. If we're all virtual, when I think about how we design meetings and activities, it's take 10 or 15 minutes to go write down your thoughts, really write them down on paper, then come back. And that small group can be facilitated in a way that's very different. It's not always easy. And I totally appreciate you giving us some tips and tricks because the more I get older, the more I'm protective of my mental capacity. As the world gets faster and faster, more people are also feeling that same way. So this has been really helpful. So, final thoughts. Is there anything else you'd want to share with people just about where they should focus, what they should be thinking about trying or guarding against? What last things would you share with our listeners?
So I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful that we will be able to figure this out. How do we design our work lives and our personal lives to harness attention so that we can be present for those things that are meaningful to us? And if we sit down and reflect, I would put on my list, reflect on how can I improve this relationship I have with devices today, knowing that we're going to figure it out.
I love it. Thank you for that. I think you were super brilliant, and this is a fascinating topic. If someone wanted to reach out to you, is LinkedIn the best way to do that?
So I'm a tech minimalist. So LinkedIn is the only social media that I use regularly. So I am Michelle with two L's, Natalia Moore on LinkedIn, and my company is Mind Equity. But yes, the best way to reach out is on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to answer any further questions.
And if you're in the Greater Orlando area, invite her to lunch, do a non-digital meeting. I do want to really thank you for sharing this. You have really inspired me to think about how I manage the design of my work, my relationship with tech since we first met. So I appreciate that. And I want to encourage all of you who are listening to think about those 5 areas that she mentioned: focus, culture, balance, environment, and digital tools, and to really examine the extent to which for yourselves you are leveraging them for your own well-being, your own ability to focus and harness creativity, and how you're also doing it for your teams. So thank you for listening to Manager, and we'll see you next time.